Luminosity painting is one of the classic luminosity techniques Tony Kuiper developed close to 20 years ago, and it remains one of the most used techniques to this day. If you completed the basic luminosity mask course, you'll notice that luminosity painting shares similarities to mask painting. The key concept will also be used as part of other techniques that are still coming up in this course as well. For years, I struggled to explain how luminosity painting works in a way that people could easily understand. Then I heard Nick Page explain it brilliantly. The idea is that instead of making a luminosity mask, you convert the mask into a selection, and then that selection functions as a stencil for painting or burning or dodging. Let's break it down into parts. The TK plugin can create burn and dodge layers for you with these buttons right here. So if I want to create a burn layer, I click there. That creates a 50% burn layer, loads a black brush, and now wherever I paint, darkens. Or if I create a dodge layer, that creates a 50% gray dodge layer, loads a white brush, and wherever I paint, lightens. If I were to create a rectangular selection, now that selection will act like a stencil, but it's a very basic stencil. It'll allow me to paint inside the rectangle. So in this case, I'm going to do it on the dodge layer with white paint. So it's keeping me painting inside the lines. And when I deselect, we can see now my dodging is perfectly stenciled in by that rectangle. Or if I made a more intricate selection, such as a sky selection, and then came to the burn layer, went back to a black brush. Let's go ahead and hide that selection. Now when I burn, the burning stays in the sky and doesn't come into the landscape because, again, it's being constrained by that stencil, my selection of the sky. It only allows me to paint in the sky, but not down into the land. And so in that way, I can burn or dodge in very specific areas of the image. Following that logic, if I were to create a luminosity mask, let's say with the yellow channel to target these yellow mosses, and then I could also modify it a little bit if I wanted to increase mask contrast. So I'll use the curves and bring up the bright parts, bring down the dark parts. And now if instead of using that mask, as we often use luminosity masks, as a mask on a layer, if I load it as a selection, that then becomes my stencil. And to do that with TK, if I want to dodge, let's say, here I have dodge and burn buttons in the output section. So if I click on the dodge output button, it will load the mask as a selection, it'll make my dodge layer for me, and it will load a white brush so I'm ready to dodge. So there we go. And now when I paint, instead of just lightening everything, I'm only going to be painting with white through that luminosity stencil, and it's going to allow my painting to just be focused on the highlights. You can see how detailed that painting is and why it's targeting my dodging to the highlights. And this allows me to control whether I'm lightening or darkening highlights or shadows or midtones, depending on whether I'm burning or dodging and whether I'm using a lights mask or a darks mask or a midtones mask. In this case, my dodging is allowing me to bring up some of the highlights that are in the landscape here. Let's look at this same concept with some other examples. In this image, if I wanted to lighten these areas behind the waterfall that I feel ended up too dark in my edit, I could come to Luminosity Masks, find a Darks mask, and I probably want to modify it even a little bit more. So maybe lighten those areas, darken these areas, create a little more mask contrast. And now I want to lighten these shadows, so I'm going to add it to a dodge layer, load that as a selection, gives me a white brush. So now I can go in and dodge in the shadows back here, and the luminosity mask stencil is keeping my painting constrained to those shadows. So in that way I can bring up those deep shadows, without also lightening, for example, the waterfall or the bright leaves and things like that. Let's look at this example. I've got some really hot, bright highlights. I've got some deep shadows. In forest settings like this with dappled light, it's kind of hard to control those. Obviously, you can use highlight and shadow sliders in Camera Raw, but I don't necessarily want to lighten all the shadows or darken all the highlights. I just want to do it very localized. So let's start with the highlights. Boy, just that alone looks like a pretty good selection of the highlights, leaving out the darks. I'm going to go ahead and work with just that lights one. Maybe I'll check a yellow channel. If I want to increase the targeted highlights, I could, but I really think this mask is going to do what I need. I want to darken those highlights. So I'm going to load this as a selection and create a burn layer. And that loads my black brush. So now I can come in and paint in these highlights, just in the areas where I feel like they're too bright. And back here, and I'm doing that only with 10% flow. Let's take it up to 20% flow so we can be a little more aggressive with that and work with some of those highlights back there, maybe some of the ones back in here, a little bit more on these guys. And let's take a look. Yeah, so it's a very localized burning that I'm able to do, and I'm not over darkening into shadows and other things like that. I did kind of over darken this flower in a way that I didn't want to. Since I'm using a 50% gray dodge and burn layer, a gray paintbrush acts as an eraser on a 50% dodge and burn layer. If I was using a transparent dodge and burn layer, then I would use the actual eraser tool. But in this case, I want to erase just with the gray brush. So I'll go ahead and load a gray paintbrush right there. And I'm going to deselect the selection. And then I can just come in and erase that burning just out of the flower there, and maybe down in here too. Yeah. Now I also want to bring up the shadows in the tree. So now I'm going to grab a darks mask. Let's look at darks mask here. See, I want to do something fairly restrictive that doesn't go into the midtones very much. Maybe that darks 4. Don't know if any of these color channels are going to get me more focused. Maybe the yellow. And I could also do a little bit of further refining of that by going into the light areas of the mask and into the dark areas of the mask, creating a little more mask contrast. And then I want to lighten, so I'm going to make a dodge layer. And that loads the selection, gives me a white brush. And now let's take that back down to 10% flow so I can be a little bit more nuanced with this and just gently paint that into these deep shadows through here. And I'm slowly bringing out some of that shadow detail. And I noticed that I went over into the forest back here a little bit where I don't want it. So that's where I could deselect, grab the gray brush, and paint back in this area to erase that out of this area back here. And now I've done a good job of that. So let's look at the before and after. The Luminosity Painting is doing a really good job of very localized tonal balancing. And that's why it's called Luminosity Painting. When I apply Luminosity Painting to clouds, I like to call it cloud sculpting because that's what it feels like I'm doing. For example, in this case, I'd like to paint in darker shadows and brighter highlights to create a little more depth and contour and drama in these clouds. So I'm going to start with a darks luminosity mask to target these dark areas of the clouds. Let's see if there's a color channel that might do a better job of focusing on the dark tones that I want. I think maybe the blue channel. And I could also increase mask contrast just a little bit here. I'll just do it with the levels. And now I'm going to burn. So I'll go ahead and create a burn layer and have the panel also give me a black brush. My luminosity mask has been loaded as a selection stencil. And now I can paint, and it's going to help me darken just in the dark areas, and it's going to follow all these contours and shapes and nice softness of those clouds just perfectly. So that I get this great burning of the shadows in a way that I could never do by hand. And that's what my burning looks like so far. I'm also adding a little bit of darkness into the mountains back there as well. And actually I like it, but if I didn't like it, I could erase it out of that area. And now I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to find a lights mask. Let's see, lights 1 or 2. Actually think I want to go lights 1.5. So I'm going to go to levels and bring the midpoint slider over to about 0.75. That'll give me a lights 1.5 mask. And now I want to dodge, so I'll add that to a dodge layer. And now with my white brush through that stencil, it's going to keep my dodging focused on the highlights, so I can lighten the light areas and create that depth and dimension and not paint into the shadows where I don't want to paint. And let's see the before and after, before and after. That cloud sculpting or luminosity painting in the clouds has really created a lot of dimension and depth. I could just make a contrast adjustment, but that contrast adjustment is going to be applied evenly across the entire image, where with luminosity painting like this, I'm able to apply both the dodging and the burning just in the areas where I want it and exactly as much as I want it. Now let's look at one final example. Luminosity painting can be a great way to add dimension to things like trees or rocks or anything that has already some highlights and shadows. If we take a look here, we can see we've got highlights on either side of the trunks and kind of shadow down the middle. And that's what's giving its three-dimensional look to all of these trunks. If I can increase the highlights and increase the shadows in a very careful way, I can make the tree trunks look even more three-dimensional. So let's take a look for a lights mask to first dodge the highlights. So a standard lights mask will do what we need, but it's also going to be dodging out into the yellow leaves quite a bit. I think if we went to a blue channel, yeah, now we really focus on the trunks and the leaves will be less affected back there. I can also do a little mask modification to bring out the highlights more and protect the leaves more, something like that. And I want to dodge, so I'll add this to a dodge layer. I'm going to size the brush so it's just a little bit wider than that light strip across there. And I could paint, but it's hard sometimes to paint a nice straight line, especially with straight tree trunks like this. So a way that I can keep my brush strokes straight is by clicking once at the top and then holding down the shift key, coming down here to the bottom and clicking again, and then it'll just paint a line all the way down in a straight line for me. And then I can come to this other side. The highlight's not quite as wide on the other side, so I'm going to use a narrower brush, click at the top, and then hold down the shift key, click at the bottom, and paint that side in. I'm going to do the same up here, a little bit wider, click, and then shift and click to draw that line. And I could do that on these guys over here. Eventually, I would continue doing this probably to every tree trunk in the image. But for time, I'm going to stop with just these guys. Let's go like that. And now I want to do some burning to make the shadowed parts a little darker. So let's come back over here. Probably go back to that blue channel. And now let's look at darks masks. Now I'm not sure. Let me check yellow, magenta, back to blue, red, green. Now I think the blue does target that shadow down the middle of the trunks the best. I'm going to go with that and create a burn layer. And with a black brush set to the width of the shadow, let's click at the top and at the bottom. Yeah, the mask is really finding those shadowed contours there. Let's do this one, click at the top, shift key, click at the bottom. We'll do these two guys over here as well. And this one, size my brush, shift click all the way down. And so now we have before and after, before and after. And you can see on those tree trunks that I did the dodging and burning, just how much more dimensional they look and how much they come out of the image at us. In this case, these luminosity stencils were able to do a pretty good job of keeping the painting that I was doing just in the tree trunks. But if I had had more overlap of this burning and dodging outside of the tree trunks, I might want to mask these layers to make sure the dodging and burning isn't going outside the tree trunks. To do that, I would probably take the object selection tool. It's not finding any of these tree trunks as an object, but I can probably draw a box to select them. Yeah, then it can find them. And I've got it set to add to the selection. So I'm also going to try these two guys right here. Okay, so now I've got hard edge selections to my trees. I can come back and select my two layers for dodging and burning, and then use the group button to add them both into a group with a white mask. And because I have the selection will become the mask. So there we go. We've got the trees on that mask, further controlling where the burning and dodging is going. So if I had been painting outside the lines, that would be a way to work with that. Burning and dodging is perhaps the most common adjustment that I make in my images. And a lot of times I'm just freehand painting to darken or lighten just with a feathered brush. But when I want to target specific tones, then this luminosity painting technique comes in handy in so many applications. And like I said, it's also the foundation of mask painting from the basic course, and it's going to be the foundation of the next couple of techniques I'm going to show you as well.